South Korea has passed the world's first ever law to limit Google and Apple's policies that require the use of their payment systems for app developers. This means developers will no longer be forced to pay up to 30% commission to the two tech giants. Also, the Korean government plans to mediate disputes over payment and purchases in the app market. Now, proponents of this law say that it will expand opportunities for developers to grow, as well as benefit customers, while critics argue the opposite. We discussed the implications of this law today with Simon Sharwood, Asia Pacific editor at The Register, and Dr. Oh Jun-seok, Professor of Business Administration at Sookyoung Women's University here in Seoul. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. And well, to start with you, Mr. Sharwood, now there's been a great deal of concern over Google and Apple taking a huge stake of developers' revenues all over the world, really. But South Korea was the first ever major economy to actually ban it by law. How significant is the passing of this law?
I think it's a very significant step by South Korea, and it's something that the world is watching. But I think the more significant thing will be how Apple and Google respond, because there are lots of jurisdictions around the world who are considering similar legislation and similar responses. What they want to know is what kind of pushback they're going to get from Apple and Google and the rest of big tech so that they can decide how they should move.
Right, so it's quite a little uncertain how they're going to respond fully, but Professor Oh, what do you think made South Korean lawmakers very determined to push through with this bill?
Out of many driving forces, it could be understood politically, but speaking of retail business and as a business professor, imagine for a moment there is a premium departmental store and 30% of commission fee, I mean that in-store commission fee, even though let's admit there are wide ranges depending on the items and then brand powers, could also be considered as good in Korea. It is to the point that startups and small and innovative companies are mad at gatekeepers of a metaverse, Google and Apple, and they are not going to take it anymore. As a result, politicians gain momentum to pass amendment to Korean Telecommunication Business Act that prevent app marketers from forcing certain payment methods, unfairly delaying the review and unfairly deleting the mobile content from the app markets. But by the way, Google and Apple are just gatekeepers with dominant market positions with no benefits. I could not agree with that. They are not only gatekeepers, but also system developers and organizers and operators in the metaverse of their own creation. They have made prior investment with risk-taking, and they need money for investing in the security of transaction and infrastructure of Apple Store or Google Play. Considering this, in this business view considered, I wonder if it is too early to finalize the enactment. Definitely, there is a room for improvement in the settlement system, and then I would say it is time to start discussion of settlement condition among related parties.
And well, Professor, now, what will be the benefits and also the costs of enforcing this law for the Korean economy?
It's like a situation of cake cutting game. For the short term, the benefit will be apparent for customer and developers. Cost reduction make business margin improved for digital startups and app stores. And the diverse digital ventures can easily get access to Google Play and App Store at lower commission fee. As a result, it will increase digital market transaction as well as digital contents and service transaction in an economy. But as Mr. Sharwood commented, what I'm worried about the response of Google and Apple. Is there any incentive to hold on this metaverse for Google and Apple? As time goes, they will change their investment plan, operating system, and shifting profit center in their business model. And another thing I'm worried about is the enforcement can transform fair competition issue into free trade issues, which might trigger trade tension between Seoul and Washington. We have to remember in 2020 when France required big tech companies to pay digital service tax, then trade fight started. U.S. administration announced the retaliatory tariff on the $1.3 billion worth of tariff imposed in French goods, including handbags and then cosmetics. The first case is very risky, I might say.
Right, so there's still some risk as to how the US market's going to respond, really. And well, Mr. Shahid, the two app store giants, they face regulatory pressure in other countries as well, though, including India. Do you see other major economies following South Korea's example?
Look, I think that there's a lot of major economies that are ready. They really want to pull the trigger. But the extent to which they move and the extent of their legislation is really going to be constrained. Certainly, we have the prospect of the USA using trade treaties to push back. But the other thing is there will be an almighty torrent of fear, uncertainty and doubt that starts to come from Apple and from Google. And we saw this in Australia earlier this year when Australia legislated to force Google and Facebook to pay local news publishers to provide links to news content. Google, on its search engine, every day put up anti-government messages saying that the government proposal was dangerous to Australia. So every government around the world has seen that happen, has seen Google use its naked market power to attempt to damage them. And so every nation around the world is going to tread very carefully when they consider this sort of legislation. But they're all considering it because it is felt that there is unfettered market power in app stores.
Right, it certainly is clear that Facebook and Apple, Google and Apple, they're not going to just, back away from this with their hands down.
No, they won't. And Google in particular is going to point out that it already allows multiple app stores on Google devices, on Android devices. And far and away, the most available and most prominent of those alternative app stores come from Samsung. Now, Samsung has been making its own app store available in literally hundreds of millions of Samsung devices for years. And it's done these deals where you can get very advantageous access to certain apps on really good terms if you use the Samsung App Store, and hardly anybody uses it. It's a flop. Samsung has kind of stepped away from its attempts to use a Samsung ID as a great way to use apps and kind of merge that in with your Google ID. Now, that both demonstrates the enormous power that Google has on the Android platform, but it demonstrates the difficulties that alternative app store platforms are going to have just capturing consumer attention. If Samsung can't do it when it puts its own app store front and centre in hundreds of millions of devices, what chance does somebody else have? Ask yourself, when's the last time you saw an app developer advertise their app as being available in the Samsung App Store? Never. You only see, get this on Google Play, get this in the Apple App Store.
Mr. Shahid, well, the question is really, as both you and Professor O have pointed out, it's the response from these two tech giants that everyone is sort of waiting for. But how much of a toll will this actually take on Google and Apple's revenue? I mean, while Korea might not be their biggest market, is it really the sort of snowball effect that they're fearing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what we've seen is when big tech sees that something is in its interests, then they very, very quickly come to the table. So there was the global call for the rapid deletion of violent terrorist content that came in the wake of the Christchurch massacre. All of big tech instantly agreed that this stuff simply must not circulate, and they'll try harder to stop it circulating. But if you look at the pushback, as we had earlier the example with France, as we have the example in Australia, that we had months of pushback around the pay for news arrangements because they saw that it would hit their bottom line. It's unknowable exactly how much it would hit their bottom lines, but there's a hit there, and no company wants to lose revenue.
Now, Professor O, now the question is, will this law actually benefit developers and customers in the long run? I mean, a local platform, one store which local telecom and internet giants are operating, it charges up to 20% on the transaction fee. So, it's not that far below down from 30%. How can the government ensure that there is fair competition in the market? I mean, we've seen previous cases like Uber where foreign services were denied access to the Korean markets, and then a few years later a local monopoly arises.
Suyong raises a good example of a local platform versus global platform, and then regulatory approach and a market approach, which is more reliable in the long term for the development of this kind of metaverse. I say theoretically, I believe in market. Two things are of greater importance in the market. As for innovation and competition, the more the better. As for transaction cost, the less the better. Market will pay the price for a greater value they get. And then making things different, generating greater value is the core competence in the market. But what about regulatory mechanism? They have poor eyesight for treating these differences. Though being fair is not the same with being equal, as regulatory fairness is imposed by law, not by choice in the market. It is very vulnerable to keep the status quo. I mean that it's a type of rent-seeking incentive. It will prevent a new state-of-art technology. In this end, in the long run, fair competition can be attained not by imposition of regulation, but by choice in the market. So I prefer the market selection rather than the regulatory approaches.
Now, Ms. Sharwood, Apple expressed concerns that this law is going to hurt customers' interests. They said that it would actually hurt customers' trust towards payment systems. Would you agree with that? What are your thoughts on this?
I think that Apple is displaying the kind of attempt to spread fear, uncertainty and doubt that is characteristic of big tech companies when they see that the tide is turning against them. Payment systems are very robust, have many layers of security. The notion that it's less safe to use a credit card with another reputable payment system is pretty hard to sustain. The fear is that you can end up with a galaxy of small app stores, and some of those operators could be inefficient, could be insecure. But if you have a look at the market for these things, imagine who might be an alternative app store operator that would make themselves attractive to a developer, because you need somebody with sufficient marketing muscle to attract an audience to the thing, and that's really hard. How hard? Well, we know that Singtel, the giant Singaporean-based telco, tried to go down the road a few years ago of becoming a vendor of digital experiences, of creating things that people could buy direct from it, and it didn't really work. There are very few examples of organisations that don't own platforms that can successfully create the kind of software market that Apple and Google operate. Indeed, even the very biggest tech company of them all, Amazon.com, has an app store, and it's tiny, it's insignificant, and it's irrelevant.
Well, Professor O, then, how do you think Google and Apple are going to make up for the loss of revenue? Do you think they're going to simply find other ways to charge customers or developers?
Yes, they will. Let's keep in mind that Google and Apple are not social infrastructure, nor international institute or NGOs. They are profit-seeking global business companies, definitely. They try to protect their business model. This kind of sudden change by regulation could break the business balance for the short term, a sudden attack on their business. But it is expected they will find other ways to make up for the losses by changing business model or the new innovation, new business. Nobody knows, but what is certain is without innovation, they will finally cost transfer will appear, and then the end customer will bear the burden of this kind of regulation.
Well, I'm afraid due to time, this is where we must leave the interview today. But that was Simon Sharwood, Asia Pacific Editor at The Register, and Dr. Oh Jun-seok, Professor of Business Administration at Sookmyung Women's University. Thank you both so much for your time and insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.